Hello and welcome to another guide for Divide et Impera, the mod for Rome 2. Today we're going to be looking at the Scordisci, which are a completely unique faction in this mod. And speaking of unique, their playstyle is pretty much unlike any other faction in the game. They focus on having short pike units in late game, combined with exceptionally competent light skirmishers that hit really hard in the charge, but don't possess the greatest of armor stats. Combine that with shock infantry, which hits hard in the charge, but is ultimately not particularly stable, and you have a very different dynamic for this faction. For by no means a power faction, or any of their tools overpowered, but when you combine the roster together, you just get a bizarre list of win conditions that no other faction truly replicates. So let's go check out the Scordisci, how their campaign start is, and as well as their ultimately very unique unit roster. Alright guys, so this is a Scordisci start position, and as you can see, you start out with one settlement here in Pannonia. This is the only major faction that starts in Pannonia, and honestly, the start position is rather interesting and unique, because you start out with close proximity to kind of like the classical world. You know, Pannonia is only a couple of provinces between themselves and Macedon. You know, it's not really that hard to get down to Macedon and Greece if you wanted to. You can always get down through Thrace or Illyria. So ultimately, you are playing in a rather familiar part of the map if you are, you know, a fan of ancient Greece, of classical history. However, you're also on the periphery, you're also on the outside. So this is a kind of a unique take on the Greece start position because, you know, I played so many factions that start around here, from the Getae to the Thracians to the Spartans to the Athenians. So to start over here is actually quite cool, and you know, pushing a little bit south and getting to the part of the map I'm probably most familiar with is a rather interesting take. However, when it comes to your start position, you're probably going to want to conquer Pannonia first. And the reason why is because you're not surrounded by all too many other Celtic peoples. To your south lie of Thracians and I guess other Balkan, you know, similar to Thracians. Anyway, is the province of Thrace, just not all the people here are Thracians. But regardless, over to the south lie the Thracians, to the east lie the Dacians, to the south also lie the Illyrians and the Greeks and Macedonians, and then to the north are mostly Germans. So ultimately, you are a ways away from Gaul and all the other Celtic peoples that it bears. So when it comes to conquering Pannonia, it's more or less a must just to get a solid Celtic population from which to grow your military going into the campaign. If you conquer elsewhere, you're going to have teeming masses of foreigners that are going to cause, first of all, public order issues. And second of all, you're just not going to be able to replenish your troops all well. So conquering Pannonia is more or less a necessity in early game, I find. Like, you could, in theory, just blitz another province. Like, for example, Dacia is usually pretty weak early on in the game. It's fully divided between 4 factions. And honestly, Dacian units in early game are a little bit lackluster. They get very strong in late game, but in early game, they're very weak. So you could also just rush Dacia in theory and, you know, literally Pelpideva is right here. If it wasn't snowing and you had more movement speed, you could potentially just go take it. But truthfully, I do think it best just to conquer all of Pannonia. That will leave you a little bit exposed, though. So you have to kind of look towards your diplomacy and figure out what you can do. But from my like playtest type of stuff, I did find that I was able to establish positive relations with most of these factions. Like the Dalmete over here, we're willing to trade. But that guy, they're not, but I think that Puli may have been. No, they aren't. But remember, there's a couple of factions that are willing to entertain trade agreements. What about the Tribali? Yeah, look at that. Your immediate neighbor in Thrace is also willing to trade, and that's going to help shield your flanks for a little bit. You might end up with a war with the Daci. That's what happened to me 2 times. So the Daci might declare war on you, but they also were willing to entertain a paid peace treaty, so you could pay money to make peace with them and just focus on these guys, or you can just take them out. They are so close to you that it's almost worth it, and these guys are pretty lackluster, so it makes sense. Now, for your early roster, you don't have the best infantry options. You're really just stuck between these Cori Levy Spearmen, which, as the name suggests, they are Levy, and they're not very good Levy. In fact, they're some of the weakest levies in the game 1 armor, no javelin volley, and weak attack stats. This is pretty much as mediocre as it could possibly get. Just for cheap, I mean 50 maintenance is like nothing per turn, but regardless, I just wouldn't bring them. They're so combat ineffective, but they'll be a liability on the battlefield. The Sakori Light Spearmen should basically make up all of your infantry. And you know what? They're absolutely worth building your infantry force out of. They come from your third population, so they're easy to recruit. And even though they only have 8 armor and they don't have any javelin volleys, their combat stats are reasonable. Definitely good enough for early game. Pretty average for barbarians, to be fair, but they'll still be more combat effective than early game Dacian spearmen, I can tell you. So definitely you want to recruit a bunch of these guys, maybe like 8 or 9 or something. The real killing power of your early game roster is going to come from this cavalry unit. Yes, it is a missile cavalry, which I typically don't advise to bring, but of all the early game missile cavalries I've yet to review, this is by far the most powerful. In fact, you know, actually, maybe the Sicilian one is of a similar caliber, but this one is just exceptionally good, man. I mean, with the 2 experienced chevrons you're going to get here, you're buying into a unit with 12 melee attack and 14 melee defense. That's so competent. Yeah, charge is not great, but that 31 weapon damage is elite. This is just an exceptionally good unit, plus, of course, skirmish capabilities, javelin throwing abilities. These guys are super good. And for your skirmishers, I'd highly recommend you just get these guys. The thing about Sakori skirmishers is that they come with 150 men per unit, making them unique. That's more guys throwing javelins, but of course more guys for the combat. These guys have about as many men as your average infantry unit. And frankly, their stats also replicate out of an average infantry unit and maybe even a little bit more. 10 melee attack, 11 melee defense. That's better than a lot of early game infantry will have. 21 charge bonus isn't small either. That's actually pretty damn good. 21 weapon damage is alright as well. And that melee 7 armor penetration is exceptional, man. These guys, they are more combat effective in early game Thracian infantry, making these guys a must-have. This is just such a good unit for the early game. You make an army like that, you can easily conquer Pannonia, and afterwards, I just recommend heading to Dacia. Such a weak, such an easily exposed province in early game, and such a wealthy region too. Also, when you're conquering, my recommendation is that you don't sack either of these Celtic cities, because you're going to want those populations in good shape. And you want public order to rebound as quickly as possible. So don't sack them, just occupy them. For Dacia, you can run around pillaging as you please, though. These populations are foreign. It doesn't really matter if many of them survive. You're not going to use them to recruit armies anyway. So that would be kind of my early game, and then afterwards, it's really up to you what you want to do. Of course, if you take Illyria, you're most likely going to get a war with Rome, so be wary of that. Thrace, though, you can quite easily take, but of course, that's going to put you in close proximity to the Macedonians. Once you start heading into Greece, the Romans are going to like that. The safest choice is ultimately just to head north. Take on the Germans, take on the Sarmatians. You know, nobody really cares if you dispose of these people, and their lands can still be economically viable, so it's definitely a good and safe option if you head north, but really you can go in any direction you want. It's truly up to you, but you know, I think the idyllic and most safe playthrough would be taking Dacia, heading north, and then just heading west after that, but you can eventually get to Gaul itself and become the kings of your Celtic cousins. But that's really it when it comes to this faction and their start. Now let's look at their buffs and debuffs as well as their unit roster. Alright, so when it comes to the buffs and debuffs of the Scordisci, you get the typical Gallic buffs, which are honestly pretty damn good. I really do like the Gallic buffs, they've really grown on me. But +1 experience rank for all Gallic cavalry units, it's just so good. So good because experienced chevrons are essential to making your units more combat effective in your adversaries in campaign. Like literally, experience can make your armies so elite, so powerful. So just starting out with that +1 is going to help your cavalry out so much. So that's obviously really good. Also, increased population from temples when culture is dominant is really good because there's so many territories you're going to conquer that aren't Celtic. But that's a typical experience of Celtic campaigns. Like all of these factions outside of the Arverni are basically out of what you'd consider like typical Celtic territory. You know, they share borders with a lot of other cultures. So being able to get a little buff to your temples, which you're going to build, is really good. But when it comes to the specific buffs and debuffs of the Scordisci, they really aren't like crazy good, I would say. They really, really aren't great. Like, increased Celtic conversion's nice. It kind of does sync up with his druidic culture buff for all the Gallic factions because, you know, Celtic conversion will mostly be caused by your temples. So ultimately, you know, having an already existent buff on your temples really just incentivizes you to build temples quite a bit. Definitely going to be investing in a lot of temples at the Scordisci. But then this new foundations one really isn't amazing. Like, reduced build time for minor cities, like, sure. That's nice, it's convenient. Not really a game-changing buff, though. It's kind of one of those that you'll take, but it's definitely not going to make your campaign super, super better. Just one of those kind of middle-of-the-rung buffs. Now, diplomatic penalty with Daco, Thracian, and Illyrian tribes is obviously terrible, because you spawn around, like, all of them. Like, you share a border with the Dacians, the Thracians, and the Illyrians, and you simultaneously get a diplomatic penalty with all of them. No, I have found that this isn't all too relevant for your campaign, because for whatever reason, the Illyrians will just naturally be willing to kind of trade with you to make non-aggression pacts with you. I have found the Illyrians to be pretty easy to entice into diplomatic treaties, so it's not that bad, but it will guarantee that the Daci, the Dacian tribe that's closest to your start city, they will just declare war on you really quickly, probably because of a debuff. So be wary. Like, this does basically make sure that you need to conquer Dacia, but you will eventually need to take on the Illyrians, like once your Imperium goes up and they start getting wary of your expansionism. It basically forces you to go south, which is a little bit inconvenient, but it is what it is. The debuff of every faction is usually significant. This one's manageable. This one's manageable because a lot of these factions aren't super difficult to get rid of in the hands of the AI, but it definitely is a little bit of a tedious debuff to have. But now let's look at the meat and potatoes of my guides, which is the army. How good is the Scordisci army? How does it stack up to the other Celtic factions? Well, we'll find out real soon. Alright everybody, so this is the unit roster of the Scordisci, and frankly, it's a rather average roster, but the way that you get an average roster with the Scordisci method, the Scordisci equation, is rather unique, very, very unique, because the Scordisci do ultimately take a lot of elements from the peoples around them. Their elite pike unit, phalanx unit is a pike unit. It's really weird. It's like a barbarian shield wall that uses pikes. Like, not super long pikes, but like short pikes, kind of like a Macedonian peltis pike. Like the Egyptian royal guard, like the Macedonian Agema spears. It has that type of pike. Just a nice, short, much more maneuverable pike. Now, that means that these guys are going to lose against, like, proper Macedonian pike phalanxes, the ones with the long sticks, but these guys will absolutely maul hoplites, even elite hoplites, and believe me, I've tested that offline quite a bit. So ultimately, it's just a really, really interesting unit to, honestly, you should have your late game mainline out of these infantry. So there's like no other faction that's going to be so reliant on short pikes in this game. So just unique. Their missile infantry, I mean, you're mostly using skirmishers here. That's definitely what you're going to prioritize, you know. The Scordisci slingers, they're good, but they're not amazing or nothing absurdly interesting or special. So it really does leave your skirmishers to be the main stars of your roster. And I mean, these guys are really good too. So just to have like such a dependence on elite javelin throwing skirmishers is in of itself a unique element. And then the melee infantry that the Scordisci have isn't like super duper strong. Like, it's just okay. It's all right. But it's strong in terms of shock value, which is, again, just kind of a unique element to have, kind of middling shock infantry as your main support to your pike phalanxes, and of course, elite skirmishers, which are going to be your main killing tool. Cavalry with the Scordisci, kind of average amongst Celtic factions. There's definitely better cavalry factions, and there's definitely worse cavalry factions. Scordisci are right in the middle. But anyway, I'm kind of giving you guys a broad overview right at the beginning. Let's just get into the basics, and then we'll zoom out once again. And we'll start the basics by talking about the generals. Now, with Scordisci Elite Swordsmen, you don't unlock them right away. I'm actually unsure of when you get these guys. It might be during the Illyrian Reforms, which happens on turn 64. It might be during the Nitos Reforms, which happen in late game, turn 90, for all of the Celtic factions. I'm actually not sure. I think it's Illyrian Reforms. I couldn't find an answer online, and I'm not willing to play a Scordisci campaign for 64 turns just for the sake of this guide. But rest assured, you don't have them in early game, so you do have to wait a little bit. But if I had to guess, I think it's Illyrian Reforms, based on the little information here that says these guys are based on Illyrian and Thracian units, as well as based on stats, because these guys are honestly, like, they're good, but they're not great, making me think that they're more of like a middle game unit. Like, these stats really feel like middle game elite unit to me. You know, instead of having the 35 to 38 armor that an elite Celtic swordsman should have, these guys only have 30. They only have 11 melee defense. You know, usually a typical elite Celtic infantryman would have 12. 15 melee attack is definitely good, but I have seen it higher, specifically for the more, like, you know, naked sword type units. Now, where this unit does excel is in charge bonus. 33 charge bonus for a sword unit is brilliant. Like, Roman units get it done with 18 charge bonus, so to have nearly double that is, of course, exceptional. But 25 weapon damage isn't amazing. Virtually every single Celtic elite infantry unit has a minimum of 30. Now, of course, these guys do try to compensate for that with 11 armor penetration, which is absurd. Like, most units, they cap out at, like, a 7 armor penetration. These guys have, like, double that, which, again, is really, really good. But to be honest with you, these guys are mediocre at best. I've, like, tested them extensively offline. They'll get mulched by Galatian Chosen Swords. Yes, the Galatian Chosen Swords, but Galatians get very early on in the campaign. It's not even a reform unit. Praetorians will discipline these guys, man. They will expose these frauds. This really isn't that good of a barbarian elite sword unit. It basically will get clobbered in a long-term affair with any elite barbarian infantry, like almost any. These guys even, like, lose 50% of the time to Arverni naked swords, which are cheaper. Yeah, these guys aren't great, but what they definitely have, which a lot of barbarian infantry can't compare in, is in shock value. That extra charge bonus, as well as armor penetration, will mean that this unit will do better charging into the unprotected rear of an infantry unit. You know, this is more of like a flanking sword. If you get these guys into an exposed rear, they'll kill quicker than, you know, a Galatian elite swordsman will. But the problem is that you want your elite swordsman to be something that you can make a, you know, mainline out of. You want it to be a unit that you can rely on en masse to hold the line, as well as to be extremely aggressive. So considering that these guys will get outperformed by most infantry in their class at a 1v1, I feel like this is less useful than most barbarian elite swords. But that's just me. That's just me. Although, to be honest, I think most would agree with that assessment. There's now your Scordisci noble pike phalanx is definitely a more interesting option. Although, to be fair, if you don't have, like, a spear wall in your army already, you're most likely not going to get these guys, because, like, I mean, come on. Like, are you really going to have only one phalanx unit in your entire army? One exposed phalanx unit? Now, these guys are absolute pros. I will give them that. These guys will beat an elite Spartan hoplite, like, not just the regular ones, like the Spartan Ajima, the Royal Spartans. You know, the 300 themselves will beat these guys in a 1v1 because their pikes will reach far further than hoplite spears. As well as these guys just have good attack stats. Like, 15 melee attack is so good for a phalanx. That's elite. This is a very, very, very elite unit. Like, while I don't like shield wall as much as I like a phalanx, these guys, like, in terms of base attack stats, are insanely good. This, I think, is similar in statistics to like a Ptolemaic royal pike. If you're similar to this unit, actually they're better. They're definitely better. I mean, you just look at these stats. Like, sure, these guys have a phalanx, which is a little bit more maneuverable, a little bit more of a disciplined formation. But every single combat stat is worse than a Scordisci Noble Pike. This is just an absolute beast of a unit. They can also perform reasonably well in melee combat too. 24 charge is really good. 25 weapon damage, not great, but again, this is a phalanx. You can't expect everything of them. And they also have a heavy mass, which is an absolute beast of a unit. Definitely would bring them over to Scordisci Elite Sword. Your Scordisci Noble Cavalry, these guys are good, but not amazing. These guys are just kind of average Barbarian Noble Cavalry. Like 38 armor, average, combat stats average, charge bonus, weapon damage. These guys are exactly identical to the Getic Noble Cavalry. Like these guys, the late ones. Except these guys do have more armor, but then these guys are available in early game. Again, very, very average. I think these guys might be identical to Rhodian Elite Cavalry. These stats look very familiar. No, not Rhodian. Not Rhodian. What was I thinking of? No, not these guys. Definitely not. Am I tripping here? They're definitely equivalent to a lot of other barbarian cavalry. Like, there's no doubt about that. I mean, they're pretty similar to these Boii. The Boii have the exact same stats outside of armor. They're better than the Boii for their armor, so there is that. But I'm pretty sure that I've seen Greek factions with similar units to this. Colchis, no, we're gonna have Cataphracts. Well, regardless, I guess it's not really important to find parity. To be stronger than a Boii is significant in of itself, since they're a competing Gallic faction. However, this is just kind of your average noble cavalry. I think the Boii have demonstrated that there's worse out there, but the Getae have demonstrated that there's better out there too. So this one's good, definitely reliable. Good armor, good combat stats. Really nothing to complain about here, but, you know, you can definitely do better than this. The Arverni can do better than this. The Nervii do better than this, too. So there's definitely better out there, but anyway. I'm saying that this is the average for too long. Let's move on to the melee infantry. Typically the most interesting category for a Gallic faction, but in this case I'd argue it's not the case. Just overall, this assortment is a little bit lackluster, but you can definitely do damage with them. There are definitely a lot of Celtic factions that do way better than this. In fact, I would say in terms of melee infantry, they're all better than this. I do think they are. Like, we still have to compare them to the Nervii, but they're better than all the other Celtic factions I've already evaluated. Sorry, they're worse than all the other Celtic factions I've evaluated. From the Arverni to the Boii, definitely way worse than Galatia. But let's start here with the Scordisci Assault Infantry. Now, this is a okay, like, early game sword. Like, firstly, you don't get them turn 1. You do need to upgrade to level 2 Barrack, which demonstrated on the campaign map. This unit's just, like, alright. They only have 150 men, and a lot of early game barbarian infantry would have 225, so while their combat stats are a little bit better than average, like, you know, 7 melee attack, 10 melee defense isn't bad, but 26 charge is exceptional, and 9 melee armor penetration is really good too. It is 150 men with only 10 armor and 49 base morale makes these guys innately just very, very unstable. Like, these guys can charge a rear, and with a 26 charge bonus, as well as 21 weapon damage and 9 armor penetration, these guys will get plenty of kills. However, if you try to use these guys as a main line, they will crumble. Way better to have your spearmen form up the main line. These guys just aren't reliable. But on the flanks, these guys can prove a cheap way to do damage. But I'd really say only have max 4 of these guys in an army if you're really struggling to recruit. Man, you know, you're really trying to save money, because these guys are cost efficient at the end of the day. I think they'll barely cost more than 100 to maintain a turn, which is pretty good. If they come from your third population class, if they're also easily accessible, but like max 4, maybe 2 if you have more funds. It's just, you know, their ability to survive long term isn't great, and even their killing ability is far from ideal, because it's 7 melee attack is kind of wimpy. Now moving on to your early Scordisci heavy swordsmen, these guys really aren't great. If I have to be completely honest with you, like this is a really, really lackluster Celtic early game swordsman. I mean, firstly, 11 melee attack and 10 melee defense is so bad. So bad for like a staple, because every single Celtic faction, every single Gallic faction has an early game and late game elite sword. You know, it either comes from your second population class or first population class, depending on the faction. Typically, if it comes from your first, it's going to be a little bit better. This one comes from your second, just like the Bowie one does. But this one's so much worse than the Bowie one. I mean, firstly, it's called Heavy Swordsman, but this is merely a medium melee infantry. You know, I mean, it's heavy in the sense that these are the most heavily armed Scordisci swordsmen in early game. Hence heavy. But they're just not good. They're just not good. 18 charge is bad. 10 and 11 is bad. 25 armor is average, but not great. 45 base morale isn't great either. No javelin volley. That's bad too. That's definitely going to take away. It just overall, when you look at these stats collectively, you know that they're worse than their competition. This is just a bad Gallic early game sword. Can it do damage against its opposition? Absolutely. You smash this into Thracians, you know, on turn 30 or turn 40. And these guys will clean house. Of course, will outcompete basic Thracian footmen or whatever you're going to be going up against. Like, this unit can do damage in the context of your campaign, but if you compare them to the tools that other factions get, this is just clearly mediocre. This is clearly mediocre, but still useful. Now, Scordisci Heroic Swordsman, I do like this unit, because unlike the naked, or I guess we can call them heroic swords, that's what they're called in Divide et Impera, but they're essentially a naked sword as they have very low armor. Their models in-game are guys in loincloths running around, but they're basically nobles who have decided to go berserk, you know, some sort of pseudo-religious fighting style, I guess. But what's interesting about this unit is that it comes from your second population class, which makes it more accessible. But our Verni ones come from your first population class. And while some heroic swords that come from your second population class are worse, this one is... How do I put this? Okay, let me just show you guys like the different ones I've seen, right? So firstly, you have the Arverni ones, which are just really, really good. They're top of the line. Like, this is the best one because it has great charge bonus, good weapon damage, great... Like, overall, there's really good attack stats, and these guys are in a medium melee infantry category, so they're a little bit harder to run over. The Bowie one, these guys, they come from your second population class instead of your first, but you know what? Instead of having, like, bad attack stats, these guys have worse charge. Meanwhile, the Scordisci one, they come from your second population class, but instead they become cheaper. And where they lose their statistics compared to the Arverni ones, which are basically perfect, is that these guys have slightly less melee attack, but they maintain insane charge damage. And that's what I like about these guys. These guys just, they go crazy on the charge. 33 charge potence is absurd. And they do 11 armor penetration, making these guys the ultimate flank charge unit, the ultimate rear charge unit, the ultimate shock infantry. You don't want these guys taking on an enemy in like long-term melee. You don't want these guys to be part of your main line. You don't want these guys to get into combat with an enemy elite sword, at least head on. But if you can wrap these guys around flanks, they will do so much to resolve the confrontation. And that's why you really need these guys, because these guys aren't going to grind out very much. Nothing of quality anyway. So you need something that's going to help even the odds. And then these guys come in. These guys come, they slam your opponent in your rear, and they help your weaker swordsmen break through. So this is a must-bring sword unit to kind of help strengthen your line, help your weaker infantry win the day. Now, your late Scordisci heavy swordsmen, you get these guys with the Nitos reforms in turn at 90, and again, just an inferior option to virtually any other Celtic sword. Like, just across the board, worse stats. 30 armor is bad. Typically, you'd expect 35 armor to 38 armor from such a unit. Low morale, under 50. Charge bonus of 19. A lot of good Gallic swordsmen have like 22 to 21 charge bonus. 28 weapon damage, that's bad. Your average, well, basically all the other Celtic swords have 30 weapon damage. And then most other Celtic swords have 12 melee defense instead of 11 and 15 melee attack. So just overall, this unit is just weaker. Again, it does come from your second population class, and it is a little bit cheaper, but ultimately, when you really take recruitability and cheapness over like overall quality, like this is the unit that you're gonna play out your late game with. These guys are gonna have to take on legionaries head on, and they are just outmatched. They're just not as skilled, not as powerful, not as warlike. Just overall disappointment of a unit. We've already gone over to Scordisci Elite Swordsmen. You know, they come from your first population class, and they are admittedly better than this Scordisci Heavy Swordsman in virtually every way. There's no way in which the Scordisci Heavy Swordsman outperforms the Elite Sword, other than it has one volley of javelins. But that's such a negligible bonus. This is definitely the better unit, but they come from your first population class, and they're pretty lackluster considering that. And again, like, this is the type of unit that ideally would be charging around the flanks, and you have your heroic swordsman to do that for less money. So honestly, I feel like you just combine your heavy swordsmen as well as these heroic swordsmen, and you get a really insane combo. When these guys engage and these guys kind of hit from the flank, cause chaos, you know? These guys hold, these guys cause chaos. Your Scordisci Assault Infantry is a cheap way to replace your heroic swordsman, if you're scrambling for cash, that is. Now, your Spear Infantry as a Scordisci are just, like, okay. They're not amazing, but they're alright. I mean, your levies are terrible, admittedly. We already went over these guys in the campaign. This is, like, the worst levy unit in the game. Exceptionally cheap, but these stats are just abysmal. This unit's basically useless at anything other than chasing down skirmishers, you know, charging on the flank. You know, this is just such a horrible unit. I wouldn't bring these guys ever. Scordisci Light Spearmen, this will be the main backbone of your first army. And it's just okay. It's just okay. They do have solid, you know, Celtic spear stats. You know, the superior combat stats of these compared to other levy spearmen, say that of the Greeks, represents the more warlike culture of the Celts. However, 8 armor and 39 base morale is a severe limitation, as well as these guys don't come with any ammunition. So this is just a perfectly average barbarian levy spearman, which is just better than the average levy spearman of other cultures, really, but, you know, this is just okay. Against the other barbarian factions, these guys won't really hold you down in early game, but they definitely won't pick you up, and after early game, you don't want to ever bring these guys. Then moving on to your Scordisci Medium Spearmen, you do unlock these guys with your Barrack level 2. You don't need any reforms for these guys, and subsequently, this is just like an alright unit. In fact, I would say that these guys basically replicate Freo Spears. They're looking very Freo Spear-like to me. Let's get, actually, the Bactrians don't have regular Freo Spears. Let's get more generic faction. Epirus. Yeah, I mean, literally, I think that's the same stats. Literally the exact same stats as Freo Spears, which, considering that you can get Freo Spears before the Greeks do, that's really good. Like, Freo Spears are super duper, super competent, exceptionally good at just holding flanks. But in this case, you might want to even make these guys as a mainline, considering that they're going to be cheaper than your swords. They're going to come from your third population class as well. I think so, yeah, they're from the Freedman class, so that's your third population. So much easier to recruit than your swordsmen, which come from your second population class. And ultimately, while they can't kill as effectively as your swords, the art is going to hold well. And this is a medium spear unit with 225 men, so just overall really solid unit. Obviously not like a game-breaking unit for the Scordisci, but just a nice tool to have. And you know, a lot of barbarian spearmen that have these stats that are medium will have like 15 armor, or they'll be like light instead of medium, so you just get a lot with this unit. Very nice. Now for your phalanxes, you're going to start out with this early shield wall spearman, which is just really, really, really solid. With 25 armor, you know, 819, like these guys have the best stats that you could expect of spearmen for the barbarians, as well as 25 armor, which is the best number that you can have for a unit that recruits from your second population class. Yes, the Arverni do have elite spears that are better, but, you know, you don't really want to waste first population class in spearmen, do you? It's kind of hard to justify that when it's just a little bit more armor that they gain. So, just overall really good. But once you get to turn 90, that's when you get those pikes I mentioned. And that's when you can consider making a proper pike wall. Now, this unit is just really, really, really solid. Again, it'll beat basically any hoplite, but lose to basically any pike, but also be a menace to enemy melee infantry. You just have to bring it. Considering how mediocre You know, all of this is. Like, this one's just solid, but by late game, it'll be outdated. You know, none of these melee infantry are super duper good. None of them are going to amaze or dazzle your opponent. So you really need these guys as the main line because they'll be something different. Just by having pikes, you'll be able to ward off the frontal charge of much, much, much better melee fighters. And that's so good. You need these guys as your main line going into late game, unless you just want to pull magic with these guys. But as for your mid-game or early game roster, you really do have to choose between having these melee infantry, which are a little bit flaky, a little bit precarious. Just remember all of the things I told you about these guys, the dangers with using them. Having a Scordisci medium spearman line, which is, you know, a little bit mediocre, but cheap and stable and reliable. Or having these shield wall spearmen, which these guys are going to be probably the most competent, probably the most capable, you know, as like a frontal main line. However, also the most inflexible and the most expensive on average. So that's basically the trade-off you have to entertain. Now, when it comes to your missile infantry, you have some interesting options, particularly in the javelin department. With the Scordisci, you get the best Celtic javelins in the game. But before we go into those, let's just go over your basic options. For your archer, you have the Scordisci archer. These guys are absolutely horrendous, as are all other Celtic archers. Now, this is the cheapest skirmish option you have, and they do come with one interesting little tidbit. If you look over here, we have 15 armor penetrating damage, which is absolutely insane. So unlike most archers, which are utterly useless in melee, these guys can do some damage if they charge into like a rear or something. But with a 5 melee attack, don't expect these guys to really like change the outcome of a battle. You know, but I'm just saying these guys can do slightly more damage on a charge, but the 14 missile damage and 155 range make this such a bad archer. Don't bring these guys if you can avoid it. They also have Scordisci slingers. These are some of the better Celtic slingers amongst the Gaulish factions, because I didn't know before this, but the Boii and Galatian slingers, they don't come with shields, which is a massive issue. You know, the shields give the slingers some survivability and allow them to win against unarmored archers in combat. If you remove that shield, the slinger becomes significantly less viable. So these guys do have shields, but otherwise are nothing special because of the one armor they possess. Now what you have which are special are these skirmishers. Every single skirmisher, that means your javelin throwing missile infantry, all of these guys come with 150 men, which is just really, really unique. It means that these guys won't be as bad in melee combat, since, you know, the restriction in number that most skirmish units have is typically why they don't do as well in melee. Obviously, like, they have reduced combat stats and usually not great armor, but still, the number of men contributes to, so, you know, just a buff to their melee capabilities. Now, your cheapest skirmisher is obviously not going to be amazing. It's kind of like your archer. You know, very high armor penetrating damage and solid charge, but overall wimpy combat stats with 5 melee attack and 6 melee defense, and also 14 weapon damage is not great either. But you know what? Better than your archer, only a tiny bit more expensive, comes from your like third class, so you don't have to worry about recruiting too many of these. These come from your inexhaustible teeming mass of commoners. But you know what? 85 range is reasonably good. Like, a lot of super low end skirmishers have only 80 range, and 21 missile damage is also pretty good. Most really low tier skirmishers only get 20 missile damage instead of 21. So overall, this one's just, you know, this unit is just really, really cost efficient. You know, it's great bang for buck. It's not a super powerful unit, but dude, it costs almost nothing. Like, these guys cost way less than like 100 per turn to sustain. Maybe they're like 70 or 80 on the campaign map. So just really cheap and really good for what you get. Great unit for the price. You know, Scordisci medium skirmishers are definitely a better unit. You know, 90 range, 22 missile damage means that these guys are elite when it comes to throwing javelins. 150 men, of course, means that they throw more javelins too. So mind that as well. You know, you're going to have way more of those extremely high-powered javelins to throw at your opponents. That's a pretty significant gain. Now, 9 melee attack and 9 melee defense is nothing to scoff at, but nothing great either. But you know what? Ultimately, when it comes to these stats, they just kind of remind me of like early game Thracian infantry. They have 150 men instead of 225, so they won't, while their stats are a tiny bit higher than Thracian footmen, you kind of need that to compensate for less men. But ultimately, these guys have, like, basically the same fighting potential as, like, a Thracian footman, which is really good for a skirmisher. You're giving yourself another combat viable infantry unit. Now, you don't want these guys being part of your main line. The, weapon damage of 21, as well as these combat stats, as well as only 15 armor, will kind of make these guys a little bit flaky, but you charge these guys into flanks, they'll do really well. But not as well as these naked skirmishers, who just have absurd combat stats. 29 charge bonus is obscene for an infantry unit. Combine that with 14 melee attack and 15 melee defense. I mean, these guys have the combat stats of Galatian naked spears. Now, 1 armor is a severe limitation, and more or less ensures that this won't really be used as a skirmisher unit, not in like the typical way, because you don't want these guys getting hit with arrows or slings. They'll die en masse. But if you deploy these guys on the flanks, they will support the rest of your shock style infantry there, and they will help them deliver a punch. These guys will do great with your heroic swordsmen. Just a wombo combo of death and destruction. Now, because these guys are so strong, you want to bring them, and they also come from your second population class, making these guys rather easy to recruit. Just such a good unit. Also, 51 base morale is crazy for a skirmisher, and of course their low armor and light nature allows them to be exceptionally quick to move on the battlefield. So you have to bring this unit. This is one of your main killing tools as a Scordisci, in my opinion. And just when you combine these guys with your heroic nobles, with your noble swords who are more of a shock style unit, you just get such a capable core of shock infantry. Nothing that's going to be like game-breaking like the Drisian nobles. But when you just combine all the different shock elements in your army and how versatile they are in terms of like armor, speed, just they come in all shapes and sizes. You just have some of the most diverse shock rosters out there with the Scordisci, as well as pikes that are just more maneuverable. Maybe you could consider them more shocky in nature, but that's maybe a bit of a stretch for me. Now, moving on to your cavalry, it's a shock cavalry, although distinction is far overused in Divide et Impera. You have just meh options, kind of resembling your noble cavalry. They go from average to bad. Starting with bad, you get your Scordisci medium cavalry. Now, these guys are recruitable from turn 1, which is kind of cool. You don't really get melee cavalry recruitable turn 1 with most Celtic factions, so that in of itself is a unique trait. But when you look at these guys' combat stats, they're just bad. They're just bad. Despite being a light cavalry, they can only move 7 instead of 8 charge movement speed. So they're not even as quick as most light cavalry. 18 armor is abysmal. 42 base morale is pretty low. 8 melee attack and 11 melee defense is pretty bad, especially for a unit with only 75 men. If it's on 90 men in this unit, I'd be like, okay, more men, worse at combat. These guys have same men, but worse at combat. Other than them being recruitable for turn 1, this is just in general a bad cavalry unit, particularly by Gallic standards. So, you do have to bring these guys in early game, more or less, until you at least unlock your noble cavalry, which is really high up the building chain. But I don't know, just overall, not really good. Also, it says medium, but these guys are light, which is, not really that good. And now moving on to your late Scordisci heavy cavalry, you get these guys with the Nidos reforms in turn 90. And ultimately, these guys are solid but not great. And really, the reason why that is because they have good combat stats with 9 melee attack and 15 melee defense. That's important. Like, a lot of units will only have, like, maybe 8 melee attack and 13 melee defense. It's your typical citizen cav experience. 48 charge is still solid, but where they kind of suffer is only 28 armor. That's not great. It's not horrible. It's not horrible like your light cavalry, but it's also just not exceptional. Ultimately, this is really a middle-of-the-line unit. Usable, usable but volatile, okay but not amazing. Not really a great option, but ultimately it's a solid option, so that's what you get here. And same thing with your noble cavalry. These guys are just overall much more powerful. If you have the capability to bring these guys, and money is of no concern, population is of no concern, bring these guys, for these guys will actually make your cavalry corps competitive against other factions, although definitely they'll lose to a cavalry strong faction that's invested mightily in cavalry in an army. But, overall, this is a capable, average noble cav unit. Now, your missile cavalry option is really interesting. I did cover this somewhat on the campaign map, but I'll go into more detail here. 85 range and 21 missile damage is alright. A weaker one would have only 80 range and 20 missile damage. So this is like an okay skirmish style cavalry. Like in terms of skirmish, at least. It's okay, but not amazing, not elite. But its combat stats are really, really solid. Like 11 melee attack and 12 melee defense. If you look at the Scordisci medium cavalry, it's better than it at melee. And they come with 90 men. And they have the same armor. But, the only thing that this one's better at, the Scordisci medium cavalry, is it has more charge. But this unit, the light cavalry, has more weapon damage. So it'll be better at prolonged melee. Way better at prolonged melee. This is just overall better, also 8 speed. This is like a really, really versatile unit. Yes, if they get caught by an elite cavalry in melee, they will get shredded, for 18 armor is a massive disadvantage. But obviously, this is not a unit to be left in prolonged, single combat with an elite cavalry. If you let these guys get charged by an elite cavalry, you're just microing wrong, for 8 speed should ensure that these guys always get away. No, this is just an exceptionally strong and versatile skirmish cavalry. I don't recommend that you bring javelin cavalry particularly often, but this is just worth bringing. In all honesty, in early game, it's a no-bringer. Bring these guys over these guys. If you want a better charging unit, bring these guys for like hammer and anvil in late game, but honestly, I would probably prefer to have this cavalry unit over this cavalry unit. Just more possibilities, more things that you can do with it. Noble cavalry, I would bring it over this light cavalry, to be honest, but I'd bring these guys over your heavy cavalry and medium cavalry. No joke. But that's it when it comes to his roster. Just overall a very interesting assortment of units. Now, I wouldn't say that this is like a super duper powerful roster. In the grand scheme of things, when you compare them to all factions in this game, they kind of lack that hyper killing component. Like outside of this Scordisci naked skirmisher, which is really, really good, there's no other category in which these guys outcompete other factions en masse. Maybe in terms of short pike phalanxes, because these guys are basically better than everybody outside of Macedon. The Macedonian Ajima, I think, is basically confirmed to be the best short pike unit. I mean, these guys are better than the base ones that you get, or better than, these pikemen. But it's identical to your noble pike. So your general is akin to the best short pike in the game, which is crazy. It's crazy to have a pike unit as strong as the best Macedonian pike of any category in a barbarian faction, particularly a Gallic faction. That is in of itself kind of cool. But ultimately, when you just look at this from the melee infantry, which are just mediocre but interesting, spears, which are just mid, phalanxes, which I guess that's good, and then your missiles, which are great, but in terms of, Peltis style skirmishers, I just feel like you get a faction that's average, especially also here, like, you have a great javelin using light cavalry. It's almost like you've maxed out your, how do I put this? Like your competence in all of the weirdest categories. Like in the most niche style units. In terms of light peltis, light javelin throwing cavalry, and short pikes. That's where all of your XP went. Kind of weird. Because of that, I'm going to say that they're a very interesting faction. Like in terms of how much you should play them, if you just want a very unique feeling to your battles, I would say bring these guys. That makes this actually a faction that's worth playing, more so than on average. I would give them a 6.5 out of 10 in terms of how much you need to play this campaign, which is, it might not sound glamorous, but that means that this is better than the average faction to play. The start position is just nothing special, and, the historical value of this faction is not exceptional, so I can't say that these guys are, like, amazing to play, but overall, I'd say that you should. 6.5 out of 10, but in terms of how powerful they are, just 5 out of 10. Average faction. straight up average faction, but the way that they are average is really interesting. Compared to like an average Hellenic faction, like, I don't know, Rhodes? It's a way more interesting than Rhodes. Just overall, if you just want a really cool campaign, the Scordisci are for you. In terms of how hard they are, I don't feel like this is a very hard campaign. Just average in terms of hard, 5 out of 10. Definitely not extremely easy. You do start out surrounded by factions that have diplomatic debuffs with you. And you could end up outworld the Romans pretty quickly if you don't play your cards right and you expand into their area too soon. You know, the Germans could come down from the north and bug you as well. I mean, just in general, like your early game unit turn 1 roster isn't great. And it's not like you spawn with massive teeming cities of populations you can use around you. I'd say 5 out of 10. You know, it's not apocalyptic, it's not extremely hard, but it's not super easy either. But that's all it is when it comes to Scordisci. Ultimately, a cool faction. I think that the Divide et Impera team, or Divide et Impera team, has done a lot to make this faction fun to play and just a unique add to this game. So well done to them. And thanks for watching this guide. If you enjoyed it, please like the video and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.